Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Carolyn Waters, the director and head librarian. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the library stands on the traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. And for those of you who may be here for the first time, we are the oldest library and cultural institution in New York City, founded in 1754. In addition to our 300,000 volume book collection, which is open to members, open stacks, and beautiful reading and writing spaces, we also offer a lot of wonderful events like tonight's, and most are open to the public. So take a look at our website, sign up for our e-newsletter, and or just talk to a staff member and find out more about what's coming up. We have a lot of fun stuff coming up. I also want to mention that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event, as well as taking photographs, so just so you're aware. And we want to thank Anna for the goodies here. So feel free to stay after, because this truly is a book party. I am so pleased to welcome Anna Pitoniak and Cristina Alger to the members' room. Cristina is the New York Times bestselling author of Girls Like Us, The Banker's Wife, The Darlings, and This Was Not the Plan. A graduate of Harvard College and NYU Law School, she worked as a financial analyst and a corporate attorney before becoming a writer. And it's great to have Anna Pitoniak back in the members' room after her previous book on Our American Friend. She is also the author of The Futures and Necessary People, and she worked for many years in book publishing, most recently as senior editor at Random House. She also writes a really terrific newsletter on Substack that is under the name The Responsible Liar, How to Stay Sane When You Make Stuff Up for a Living. I personally love it. Yes. You talk a lot about routine, which you and I have this, we have this common interest in people's habits and routines. She's also a member of the New York Society Library, proud to say. Yes, yay! Anna's book, The Helsinki Affair, is brand spanking new, like 2 days, I think, right? Okay, I think the Washington Post has just had this amazing review. It says it's atmospheric, well-researched, and packed with tradecraft, conspiracies, murder, and best of all, 2 fascinating women. The Helsinki Affair fills a gap in spy fiction, and People magazine called it delicious and a must-read book for fall. We have books for sale by our friends from the corner bookstore. Sasha is right outside, so please see him out there. I'm sure Anna would be very happy to sign it afterward. And the link for those of you on the live stream to purchase is in the live stream chat. And we also want to be sure to include some question and answer afterwards, so think up your questions and save them up for the chat after the presentation. Please enjoy this conversation between Cristina Alger and Anna Pitoniak.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's so special, this moment of launching a book into the world and seeing all these faces from different parts of your life all in one place. So it's just a very, joyful moment, because writing a book is such a solitary thing, but this part is not solitary. So before we get into our conversation, I'm just going to read a very short passage from the beginning of the book, just to kind of set the scene a little bit. You don't really need any context, because this is literally page 1, chapter 1. It wasn't exactly the sensible thing to do, standing outside in the hot noon sun in July in Rome. Semenov paced back and forth, mopping his brow, his handkerchief long since soaked with sweat. No, this wasn't sensible. He ought to have done as the Romans did, escaping the summer heat by stopping at Giolitti for a cone of gelato, or napping in a shuttered bedroom, or fleeing the city altogether for the breezy hills of Umbria. But Konstantin Nikolaevich Semenov was not standing here, pleading to be admitted to the American embassy, insisting that he had urgent information to share, because he was an entirely sensible person. In his air-conditioned booth, the soldier hung up the phone. "You need to make an appointment. No one can see you today," he said. "Sir," Semenov exclaimed, leaning toward the pinprick holes in the glass, "you are a Marine. I am speaking to you as a fellow military man. I am an officer in my nation's army, my nation, which is Russia." a needless emphasis, as 10 minutes earlier he had slid his passport under the bulletproof glass barrier to identify himself. You must understand, I have information that matters today, not tomorrow, not next week. In fairness to the soldier, Semenov was a hard man to take seriously. His shirt buttons strained to contain his plump stomach. His pockets jingled with loose change. Behind his round glasses, his eyes were wide and guileless. But when the Marine hesitated for a moment, Semenov's instinct, which was well honed, told him to seize his opening. I am from Moscow, Semenov lowered his voice. I'm here in Rome on holiday with my wife. It would not be possible for me to communicate this information while in Moscow. The nature of my work means that I am closely watched. Do you understand? The nature of my work has also exposed me to certain information that I believe your officials will value. Even if that's true, the Marine said, you still need to make an appointment. The Marine was no more than 24 or 25 years old. Crew cut, clean shave, trim as a sharpened pencil, a good soldier, a rule follower. To grant exceptions to the rules, to take pity, for instance, on a sweaty stranger with a thick accent, required the seasoning of age, which he didn't have. And so Semenov realized with some reluctance that he would have to resort to blunter tactics. Semenov stood up straight. A change passed over his features like a shadow passing over the sun. Staring at the Marine, he said, "My information concerns Robert Vogel." There was the tiniest flinch in the young man's brow as he registered the name. Senator Vogel's flight is due to land in Cairo in 1 hour, he continued calmly. His life is in danger. That's it.
Hi. I'm so excited to be here. I love this book so much. I got to read it a few months ago, and I was so thrilled when Anna asked me to do this event because I've been, when you read books early, you sort of wait for them to come out in the world so you can talk to other people about them. And that's one of the strange things about being a writer is that you often read books but wait well before they come out. And so Tuesday felt like this really exciting day because I could tell, like, my husband downloaded it. And I emailed my friends, and I was like, this book is so good, you have to read it. So anyway, this is really exciting because I get to talk to Anna and all of you about this wonderful book. So I am going to assume that most people haven't read it since it just came out on Tuesday, so I'm not going to quiz anybody, and I won't do spoilers. But I do want to talk about it because there's so much to talk about. So the opening paragraph, I forgot, the opening passage sort of brings up this concept of rule breaking, which is really interesting because I wanted to open by talking about this article that you just wrote in Crime Reads, which you should all go read because it's also really great, in which, well, you can sort of summarize it, but Anna sort of makes the point that there's like a very fine line between spies and criminals, and they have like a great amount, sort of great moral ambiguity or dexterity, and they're people that while they don't break rules for their own sort of hedonistic pleasure, they are sort of accustomed. Breaking rules is sort of commonplace when you're a spy. And so anyway, I wanted to, did you intentionally put that in the first paragraph? Because I feel like this book plays with that a lot, like this concept of like, when can you break rules? Like, what is the line between like sort of lies and truth? And I think that's what we all find so interesting about spies generally, is that their life is kind of a construct.
I wish I could take credit for planting that idea
very,
very purposely in those opening paragraphs, but it was one of those insights that kind of arose based on the character I was writing in that moment, which was the young Marine who's maybe this is one of his first stations abroad. I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, well, he is not a spy and therefore he's not accustomed to breaking the rules or manipulating things. But I do think that it's a theme that kind of wound up coming out over and over and over again as I wrote this story and as I created these characters, which is that some of the characters are a little bit more rigid in a mindset. They want to follow the rules. They adhere to the code of an institution, and they're frankly just not quite comfortable with granting those exceptions to the rules. But I think that the best spies are the ones who think on their feet and decide when they can sort of set a rule aside, set a law aside, set a certain precedent aside, and do whatever it is that needs doing in that moment. And I do think that it is the kind of thing that one probably has to learn more about as one gets older and spends more time in this profession. And I'm sure this won't be the first time I invoke George Smiley this evening, because he's like my favorite fictional spy, and someone I talked about in that Crime Reads piece as someone who sort of has that seasoning of age and knows when he can get away with breaking the rules. And there's a great line in one of the Smiley novels, I think, where he talks about how it's just when the spies reach retirement age that they're really starting to accumulate that finely honed instinct about when one can kind of go rogue and swerve left or swerve right. But that's inevitably when they're kind of shown out to pasture. So I do think it's really interesting, this idea too, that that's a particular part of spying that isn't necessarily about being like young and fit and strong and running and shooting things and all of that, but having this kind of mental and emotional maturity.
And I think one of the things I love about this book is that there's not just one sort of totally badass woman in the book, but there are two, and they're of different ages. And so do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Amanda and Kath and sort of how they play off each other? Because
Sure.
I find their relationship fascinating.
Yeah, I love these two women at the heart of the story. We have Amanda Cole, who, if I had kept reading the paragraphs right after where I stopped, you would meet her. She's the protagonist of the story. She's the one who winds up meeting with the Russian who walks into the embassy and setting the plot into motion from there. And Amanda she's a great spy, but she is a little bit younger, a little bit earlier in her career. And when compared to Kath Frost, who's the other woman in this story, Amanda is more of a rule follower, a little bit more cautious in nature. Now, this is grading on a curve. She's still a spy. She's still pretty comfortable with taking a lot of risk, but she's still kind of figuring out how to be in the world, how to be in this career, and trust her gut, as well as working within the confines of this institution. So I love Amanda, but she's, I would say, a little bit more of an ordinary kind of person. And I say that with affection. And then we have Kath Frost, who's older. She's been around for many decades longer than Amanda, and she's a real character. Love Kath. She came up during the Cold War. She was one of the few women at the agency in the 1970s, and really marches to the beat of her own drum. And she never hesitates to follow her gut instinct, even when it looks weird, even when it doesn't really make sense to other people. And she becomes a mentor to Amanda over the course of this story. They work together on this Russian conspiracy, and they complement each other quite nicely. But what I loved about writing the character of Kath is that I felt like I had so much to learn from her. And so when I was putting her down on the page, I kept thinking, like, I want to be more like Kath.
Totally. Was she in the first draft? I mean, because the book is really at its core a book about a woman and her father. Mm-hmm. But was she was she as big a part of your first draft, or did she sort of develop over time?
She was always there in the first draft, but when she walked on stage, she kind of surprised me. Yeah. There was a moment, I think she comes into the narrative in chapter 3 or chapter 4, something like that, and I remember having this instinct of like, Amanda needs someone she can work with, someone she can learn from. Like there's a piece missing from this story right now, and I know I want it to be another woman. And when Kath came on, she kind of just took over in those scenes. And I found that the more time I spent writing her, the more interested I got in her. And the more I really loved putting her in scenes with Amanda. And I will say in subsequent revisions, I wound up going a little bit deeper into their dynamic and into what Kath had to teach Amanda. She kind of guides her through some sticky situations because, as you mentioned, it's a story about a woman and her father and this very difficult conflict, a question over whether Amanda's loyalties are going to ultimately prioritize her father or her country. And Kath is one of the people who sort of holds her hand through that process and helps her think about what it is she wants to do.
So taking that point, so how much do you plot out your books, and how much is sort of organic, and how much do you let the characters kind of develop in their own way, or do you plot everything meticulously? What's your process?
So this book, interestingly, sort of marked a change for me. This is my fourth novel, and for my first three books, I always had a sense, even if it was somewhat nebulous, of where the story was ultimately going to end up. So I had an idea of the central conflict, the sort of big climactic moment that we were driving towards in the story, but I didn't necessarily know where the story was going to begin. For this book, it kind of happened in the opposite fashion, which is that I had this idea for an opening scene, which is the scene I just read for you all, and that scene, that idea has pretty much remained intact through all of the drafts, which is the first time that's happened for me, because usually I have to rewrite the beginning 100 times to get it right. But I had this idea, and I thought, that's fun, and I want to see where it would go from there. And now I had been thinking generally up until that point of getting that idea, like I want my next novel to be a spy novel. I want it to be about women. I want there to be both a present day story and a story set in the past during the Cold War. I want the narrative to braid back and forth between those two. So those sort of general predispositions were floating around in my imagination. But when I got the idea for this beginning, I decided to just sit down and start writing it without a clear sense of where the story was going, without plotting it ahead of time, without outlining it. And I think part of the reason I felt so liberated to do that is both because it was my fourth novel, and maybe I felt a little bit more confident in my ability to just trust myself in the writing process, knowing like I was capable of writing a good scene or, figuring out who a character was. And part of it, too, was that I started writing this book in April 2020, when the world was obviously totally shut down during the pandemic. And I was at home. I was living with my parents. I had nothing else to do. I was wrapping up edits on my previous novel, and I thought, I'm going to go crazy if I don't start a new book. And there was this sense, as strange as it is to say, that, the world was a very scary place at that moment in time. And none of us had any idea of what the future was going to hold. And I thought, you know what, if things are this terrible, if I have no idea what life is going to look like in 6 months, I might as well take the risk I've always wanted to take and just try writing this spy novel and just go for it and just do it to keep myself entertained. And I really did. I was sitting in the corner of the living room, like laughing to myself, writing these, scenes with the KGB, and I think not having it be too meticulously plotted or mapped out really helped make it feel kind of lightweight in a way.
And there's a lot of humor in it, too. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what I think makes it work, is like it's fun. It's like the pace is great. You love the characters.
Yeah.
Kath is really funny. She's really engaging.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. There's like a certain humor that I think underlies like all great kind of most great spy thrillers.
Yeah.
So talk about the research, because then if you're in your room by yourself alone, how
Yeah.
do you research a book that, I think one of the like gating items for a lot of writers I know about like an actual spy novel, and your last book kind of, I feel like edged up against a lot of the topic of Russia and like spy craft, but to actually write a spy novel, I feel like it's a little bit, daunting, the process of researching it,
Yeah.
unless you in fact are a spy. But
Yeah.
So can you talk about what you
Which I
did
keep
to-
claiming I'm not. And I swear I'm not, but how would you know? So it was really helpful, the fact that my previous novel, Our American Friend, had a spy fiction component to it. I often say that book was maybe 50% spy thriller. That might even be a little generous. It might have been like 30% spy thriller. The rest of it was more historical fiction, political thriller, that kind of thing. But I did so much research for Our American Friend, far more than I could ever have used in that novel, a lot of which went into initial drafts of that novel. And then my editor helped me see that, we didn't have to include this whole letter from Jimmy Carter, reprinted in the novel, even though it was a very important letter. Like, okay, that kind of thing. And part of the reason I did so much research for that book is because I was just so fascinated by it. It was like my own self-created crash course in the Cold War and the CIA and the KGB, and especially like the late stage Cold War when Gorbachev came to power. And I have to be careful because now I'll just go off on a tangent and I'm going to rein it in. But I did so much research and kind of immersed myself so deeply, mostly just through reading. And the Society Library was so incredibly helpful for that. I would just like kind of wander through the stacks and, I'd read a work of narrative nonfiction that was shelved in one section, and then I would see something next to it and think, oh, I should read that too. And this is just a plug for, libraries and open shelves. But it was almost like I was storing up this research that I wouldn't necessarily use, but that came in so handy for the next book I was going to write. And I think writing the Helsinki Affair felt a lot quicker and more fluid than Our American Friend even did, because I'd done all this research and I'd kind of digested it and metabolized it. And even in late 2019, I did a couple things that were sort of technically research for my previous novel, but wound up being very helpful for this book, which is that my husband and I traveled to Russia for about a week and spent a little bit of time in Helsinki on the way home. And that was late 2019, so not long before, the world shut down for a long time. And I also had the chance to spend an afternoon at the CIA headquarters in Langley, meeting with some folks there. They answered some of my questions. This is something they do fairly regularly for novelists and screenwriters to help.
How really? Like,
yeah.
How did you find out about that?
Well, you kind of have to like have like friends in DC who like know someone who knows someone. So we have this friend who used to work in the intelligence community, and that's as far as he'll take it with us. He's now at the Department of Defense. But he said, my professor at Georgetown, he's friendly with someone in the press office there, and I'll see if I can put you guys in touch. And it took a while to come about, but they did, they did invite me in for an afternoon, and I'm sure they did a background check on me. And I think the fact that I had published a few books already helped, cement my credibility perhaps, but it was really helpful and just really interesting as an exercise in which, the CIA is used to seeing themselves depicted in a quite, cartoonish, almost cliched light in pop culture. So they're always trying to correct that cartoonish depiction and introduce some subtlety and nuance into it. It's sort of a gentle form of propaganda, a little bit, but at the same time, I was able to ask them some questions and get some very helpful answers. So those were all things that I took lots of notes afterwards. I had all these impressions, and those were all in the back of my mind when I sat down to write this book.
So did you know when you were writing Our American Friend that this was like your next book, or did you just sort of feel like you had all this, I don't know, excess interest and information on Russia that you needed to put somewhere?
I would say I had a directional instinct, which is I knew I wanted my next book to be spy fiction. I knew I wanted it to have a Russia angle, probably have a present day and a Cold War, tying together in the narrative, but I didn't have the specific seed of an idea for how this book began, for what the conspiracy would be. And I didn't yet know who, Amanda Cole was, or Charlie Cole. Certainly didn't know who Kath Frost was yet. That all sort of emerged more organically from the writing. So.
And there's a financial component to the sort of conspiracy. So how did you come up with that, and how did you research it and not sort of drown in? So my books I feel like I have a finance background, so I find financial crime super interesting, and
Yeah.
like no one else does.
Yeah.
So my editor is always like, "Whoa, dude,
Yeah,
this
this
is
is a
way
lot.
too much
This is a lot."
information about,
Yeah.
So, but you struck a really nice balance where it is a financial crime, but you sort of give enough information that you're not talking down to
Yeah.
the reader, but you're
Yeah.
also giving them enough information that it's an interesting crime.
Well, first I'll just say I hope your editor never dissuades you from writing about financial crimes, because I think it's such a great component of your books as well, and I think it's such a sort of delicious conspiratorial possibility for novelists to explore, because it's kind of hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
Like, it's in the world around us. It's not as perhaps glaringly obvious as like someone, robbing a liquor store at gunpoint right in front of you or something like that. But it's very, it can be very like insidious, and you don't even know it's happening. So I think that it's always fired my imagination in that way. But for the particulars of the kind of financial crime and conspiracy that lies at the heart of the story, which is really this like sort of financial misdeed that Russia is using as a way of gaining leverage over these American companies and bending them to their will, I had an initial sort of scheme in my first draft and my second draft of how I thought Russia and these oligarchs might conceivably gain leverage over these American companies and almost blackmail them into doing what they wanted, and in so doing, kind of achieve this geopolitical advantage over America. So I had this in the draft, and then I shared that draft, as I always do, because he's my first reader, with my husband, Andrew. And Andrew knows a lot more about finance than I do. And I'm so glad he caught this, because I just never would have known. I had described some like mechanism by which these trades would happen and da-da-da-da. And he was like, Anna, I hate to break it to you, but like the SEC would catch this right away. And they would just like roll it back immediately. And it just like, it wouldn't work. And I was like, well, like shit. So like if the SEC is just going to stop it. Yeah. I was like, how are like this, then the whole book falls apart. And this is like a very crucial thing. It's this like sort of very important keystone to the narrative, even though it's not what the book is about, but it was like a central hinge point. So I remember Andrew and I went for this walk, and I was like, well, I gotta think of something. It's like this, sort of 10-page stretch in the story, and I just need to like plug something else in that's not going to too greatly affect the rest of this house of cards. And Andrew, it like full credit, had this idea for kind of riffing on what was happening in the real world at that moment in time, which was the whole meme stock phenomenon, like, GameStop and AMC, and people just bidding up these stocks like crazy, sort of just for kicks. And, what if such a thing were to happen, but there was a nefarious actor behind that drive to bid a stock up. So I was very lucky in that I didn't have to like fully dive down this, rabbit hole of research to understand that, because I kind of had a shortcut.
Inside source.
So, yeah.
So your next project, and we've talked about it a little bit, but what can you tell us about your next project, and what can you tell us about your next project?
Yes. It's a great question. So the next book that I'm working on is going to be a kind of follow-up to the Helsinki Affair. And that mainly means that we're going to be seeing more of Amanda Cole and more of Kath Frost. And when I finished writing the Helsinki Affair, I would say when I started writing the book, I didn't necessarily think, oh, these are characters who I'm going to want to continue with. But by the time I finished the book, I thought, I definitely want to continue with these characters. They were, for the first time, I felt like these are characters who I'm not finished with yet. They're not finished with me. There's more to say here. There's more to explore. And so I'm really excited to keep writing Amanda and Kath, and to, dive even deeper into their kind of adventures and their friendship and their dynamic between one another. So the book that follows the Helsinki Affair will be, it'll be a standalone, in that you don't have to read, one book in order to read the next. Yep. So not like strictly a sequel in that sense, but very much linked. And I'm starting to it's interesting. It's been a really interesting challenge revisiting the same characters over again. And we've talked about this a little, and I've talked about it with some of my other writer friends. I initially thought it was going to be a little bit easier because I already know who Amanda is. I already know who Kath is. Like, I'll write this book fast. It'll be, no sweat. But returning to these characters and realizing that just because they went through certain arcs, they changed in certain ways in this book doesn't mean that they're finished with changing. Of course, they have more ways in which they might evolve, more things to discover about themselves. And so it's been interesting for me as the author of these characters to realize, like, oh, they're going to continue to surprise me. I don't fully know them yet, much in the way that you never fully know another person, even someone who you've spent your whole life with. They're still totally capable of surprising you. So that's been really fun to discover that that these characters, they talk back, they push back.
Yeah.
They remind me that I am not wholly in charge of this thing.
Which makes it fun, right? I mean, no
So
one wants,
fun.
if they were static, you
Yeah.
wouldn't want to write a book about them.
Yeah.
Have you thought about, or is there any thought to adapt it for television or film? Because I think it would be really great.
I agree. So I haven't yet had conversations about the Helsinki Affair. I've had like a few, conversations in the past for other books, and it's been, as many people probably know, a kind of strange time in Hollywood
Yeah.
the last like 6
Strange
months.
year, yeah.
And things are just starting to open back up. So my sense is that will be, coming in the weeks and months ahead, sending the book around to producers and that kind of thing. But I do think that I could easily see this translating to some visual medium, because it is, I think there's been a lot of great spy fiction in literature, but there's a lot of great, spy narratives on TV too. And I do think it makes...
It's the best TV.
It's the best. It's the best.
And then looking at your 4 books, sort of your body of work now, do you see sort of through lines in your work? I mean, we sort of hopscotch from Our American Friend to this book and then your next book, and there are threads that tie them. But I always find it interesting when you sort of look back on, like, what have I been doing with my life for the last 12 years?
Mm-hmm.
Like, like, are there things that you just keep writing about that surprise you or don't surprise you, or?
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And this is, again, I'm going to give some credit to my husband here, because I sometimes find it hard to take a step back and look at my work with, any kind of objective point of view. But we've talked about it before, and in talking about it with Andrew, started to realize that there is a kind of connective thread between all 4 of these books, even when it's not immediately obvious, which is that in all of these books, whether it's the futures where you have these young characters who are freshly arrived to New York City out of college, making their way in the world and really figuring out how to relate to, their jobs, their careers, which is so much of how they're establishing their identity in those early years in New York, and realizing, okay, my job defines me in a certain way. It's asking me to be loyal to these institutions in a certain way, whatever company I work for, but like, how does that actually sit with me?
Yeah.
Like, am I comfortable with that, or do I want to, make a different decision? And wrestling with that tension between your own sort of inner moral conviction or instinct and whatever it is that the institution is asking you to do. That's certainly also true to some extent in Necessary People, which is about these 2 best friends turned workplace rivals, who are both coming up in the TV news industry. It's very fast paced, it's very competitive. And again, there's a certain set of rules that you have to play by in order to get ahead in that industry. And those rules may not always mesh with your own, inner moral instinct. I think Necessary People is actually maybe the rare exception, and I don't think this is a spoiler, among the 4 books where the character hews a little bit more towards the kind of cutthroat, all-in, ambitious point of view, as opposed to, am I really comfortable with this? Let me step back and wrestle with it myself. And that's certainly that wrestling with what I really believe versus what this what the people around me tell me I ought to believe. That's something that's very true in Our American Friend and the Helsinki Affair, because that's kind of the definition of these people who decide to, like Semenov, turn against his country because he is not on board with whatever it is that Russia's doing. That's him deciding for himself, breaking the rules, as it were.
Love it. That's so interesting. So what would you, for people that love this book, what else do you recommend people read, or what have you read that you liked recently?
I'll always recommend, John le Carré as the great, but probably people have already read that. Another author who, again, most people are probably already familiar with, but who was really my on-ramp into spy fiction in my 20s was Alan First, who's so fantastic. And he was one of the first writers who really showed me that spy fiction can be so beautifully written, so atmospheric, so evocative. And he's certainly less well-known than a John le Carré, but I absolutely love his books. I think that Chris Pavone is another great writer. I know someone, you know him as well. And I've really enjoyed his spy thrillers for their kind of focus on these, female characters, this sense of nuance, this moral complexity, and the fact that they're not just all, fast-paced shootout scenes. So, yeah. And then this is nonfiction. So it's a little bit different, but the writer Ben McIntyre, who writes these, spy narratives, he's the best. And recently one of his books was adapted into a TV series called A Spy Among Friends, which was about the Cambridge Five and Kim Philby. But McIntyre's books truly read like thrillers, like you cannot put them down. And I've recommended those books to many friends, including some in the audience, and they never, ever, they never disappoint. Those books always are a hit.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Should I open to questions? I can talk all night, but you guys must have questions.
So I have a microphone here to share with people.
Hi, how you doing, Anna?
Hi, UT. I'm good. How are you?
Great, thank you. So my question is, where would you say you source your? Sorry, everyone's looking at me. Like your passion for what you're writing about. Are these like the things that you write about in all these events? Are these things that you grew up with that made a change, or like were really important in your life, and that's why you're writing about them now? My question is like, where do you source like what you're writing about and what you're talking about, and when you're finding yourself in a block, like where do you source like all these ideas? And
yeah. God, it's such an interesting question, and it's such a slippery idea, like inspiration. Where does it come from? I think that often I don't know, and I would say usually when the writing is going really well, I don't necessarily know where something comes from. Like, I'm describing a character a certain way, I'm moving through a scene in a certain way, and it's not like I'm thinking of a specific real world analog and then plugging that in. It's more just kind of almost letting myself detach a little bit and letting whatever the creative force is inside of me, like, make those decisions. But I think that a lot of the raw material that gets kind of stored inside of you, which winds up coming out as inspiration, comes from just keeping your eyes open and observing the world around you and figuring out what it is you're curious about, and then just like letting that curiosity in. So I would say I'm someone who's always been, I'm always kind of trying to figure out what the story is in a given situation. Like if I'm observing a couple of people in a coffee shop or something like that, and I see them interacting in a certain way, like I can't help but wonder and speculate, like, oh, what might be going on there? Or, when even if I'm out like at a party or at a bar, like there's a little part of me that's almost like detached in my brain and like almost figuring out what the story is in that moment. And now this can sometimes be a little bit annoying because sometimes you just want to be present and like not think about what the story is and not speculate, like just be present. But that's there's always a little part of me that isn't fully present, that's like thinking about, what are all the threads that led up to this moment, what's going to lead out from this moment. And that kind of storytelling instinct is what just hoovers up all that information.
So Anna, having been an editor, how has that affected your writing? Do you have that black crow on your shoulder always saying, well, this sentence is too long, or why bother with this?
Yeah.
I mean, is it mixed up in the writing with you?
I think I've managed to do a pretty good job of keeping the editor brain and the writer brain separate while I'm in the process. Certainly the process of the first draft. Because if I let that editor voice in even like 1%, it would just kind of shadow over the whole thing. So I tend to turn that part of my brain off pretty, pretty strictly. I turn it off when I'm in the early stages of a book. But when it comes to the revision process, I do think that I let the editor back in a little bit more, and that can be really helpful. I mean, I learned so much about what makes a book work by working as an editor, and I never want to discard that sort of experience. And I'll always remember what my boss at Random House said in, one editorial memo that she sent to one of her authors, saying, by page 25, there needs to be a kick up in interest. And then page 50, again. Page 75, again. And by page 100, it needs to be totally airborne. And I always thought of that as like you can use that as a shorthand. Like, there just needs to be this ratcheting up in action or tension or stakes until a certain point when you can just trust that it's going. And I do use that. Sometimes I look at the page count. I'm like, it's page 25 and nothing's really happened yet. Like, I gotta figure out a way to make that happen.
One other quick question. I just met a spy, a person who worked for the CIA for 6 years in Bahrain, and she's written a novel, and that has been vetted by the CIA. Do they want to vet you? Do they?
No, they don't. They don't care about me. No, they don't want to vet me. I think that they'd rather have just be like, that lady's doing whatever she's doing. Like, we haven't even tried to put any official stamp on that.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Andy.
So have you ever, or would you go back and read futures? And when you do, or if you have, how does that look to you now, given that you're on your fourth book, in terms of, do you see great progress in your style and whatnot?
Yeah, it's been, so the futures came out in January 2017, so it's been it'll be 7 years in January since that book came out. And I have never gone back and reread it. And partially that's just, well, first of all, I always have so many books stacked up on my bedside table, and I'd always be more excited to read those than to reread my own work. But I think there's a little part of me too that's like maybe not quite ready to revisit it, just for the like, I don't know if it's a cringe factor or, I would have done this differently. I'm sure that if I read the futures, I'd probably feel a mixture of things. One might be like, wow, I'm so glad I wrote this book. I'm proud of this book. This is the book that got my career started. But also, wow, I would have done it totally differently now. But I do find myself thinking about the characters from the futures with some regularity, because they're the very first fictional characters I ever, wrote a novel about. I spent a lot of time with them. And I find myself wondering, I would say of all the characters I've written, they're the most like real world characters. I find myself wondering, like, I wonder what they're up to today in their lives in the year 2023. Okay, I will. Thanks for the rec.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Melissa.
I just wanted to ask you how you learned the research process. Like, a research process is really different, I imagine, for a novel versus any research you'd done prior when you were in school.
Yeah.
So how did you learn that process, and how do you figure out how to go the right depth and not end up in a deep rabbit hole?
I'm not sure I ever figured it out with a perfect, efficient balance. I think I did go a little too deep down the rabbit hole at times, but at the same time, I really enjoyed going down the rabbit hole. And I think part of it was realizing that I was doing the research not just in service of whatever novel I was working on, but just in service of my own interest. Like, it's very interesting. I can read a whole biography of Lenin, and it's kind of just fun. Like, I'm a super nerd at this point. And as for the process, I kind of just followed my curiosity throughout. There was no rigorous structure to it. I did find that when I was doing my research, whether it was for this book or my prior books, I would almost imagine it like a funnel, and I would start very broad. Like, I would read the broadest possible history, like, of the Cold War, let's say. And then within that, I would find that one or two things really caught my interest, like a certain person or place or event in history, and I would want to know more about that. And I would just read more about that and set everything else aside, and that would cause the funnel to narrow until I zoomed in on, like, I'm really interested in these specific years, this specific place, this specific kind of dynamic, and then just go in on that, as opposed to trying to learn everything there is to learn about the Cold War.
Anna, along that line, I think you should share with people the moment of panic that you had in France as you were getting ready to fly from Marseille to Moscow as to your
Yeah,
research.
I'm pretty sure this is my dad. I'm I'm pretty sure you asked this question at the Our American Friend event too. So I apologize to anyone who already heard this. But yeah, so we went to Russia. It was October 2019. We were flying there from France, where we'd been with our family on vacation. And I, at this point, was deep in the research process for Our American Friend. I'd been reading all of these books, taking all of these notes. And my parents asked me, like, oh, are you nervous at all if the border security asks you, why are you coming to Russia? Like, what's the purpose of your trip? Are you going to tell them it's research? And I was like, no, I'm here on vacation. I'm not a journalist. I'm not anything like that. And they were like, oh, well, you sure they're not going to, like, look at your devices, like, look at your computer or anything? And I was like, well, probably not. And, like, what do I really have on my computer anyways? And then I was like, well, I guess I do have an entire folder and a document called CIA and KGB spying notes .doc. And yeah, that might look weird. And then I was like, I'll quickly change the name of that doc to, like, recipes.doc. And then it occurred to me, like, they can look at the metadata and see that 12 hours before you got to Russia, you changed the name away. And then I was, like, mentally looping. I was like, do I give you guys my laptop and not take it with me? And then I was like, if the Russians think that a person who is so obvious as to have a file on their computer that's like CIA.doc, if they think that woman is a spy, then, God help us. But yeah, but I didn't get arrested. I made it home safe in the end.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
I was so excited to hear that you can really see this as a TV show or a movie. If it were entirely up to you, who would play Amanda and Kath?
Oh my God, what a great question. So for Kath, I have an answer, but that's because my agent PJ planted this idea in my head when he first read the book, which is that he could totally see Allison Janney as Kath, which I love. I love. Amanda, oh my gosh. See, Amanda, in a funny way, I feel much, like, closer to her as a character, but she's a little bit harder for me to, like, picture. I almost have, like, I can kind of, like, see her in outline, but, like, if I zoom in too close, like, I can't quite see her face. So we need an actress who's on the short side, who's, not strikingly beautiful, who's around the age of 40. So who? Kate Mara. Oh, Kate Mara. Oh, that's a good, thanks, Jasper. Kate Mara. Kate Mara and Allison Janney. Yeah, that's who I see.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
I have a hard question for you.
Okay.
One of the things that's really fun about the book and talking about the book has been the psychology of recruiting and retaining spies. Mm-hmm. If a foreign agent from the Canadian government or the British government were trying to recruit you as a spy, what angle do you think they would take?
Oh my gosh. They would just ask me nice questions at my book event. No, seriously, they would probably say like, "Wow, I loved your book," and like, "Can you come like give a talk to my organization?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And then they would like be really nice to me, and I think it would be a combination of like a little bit of ego flattery and just like playing on my naivete. I think that it's weird, it's funny. I can be certainly a very like, a person with an imagination that's clearly capable of like going to dark places, but I can also be very, very trusting. And, if someone were to tell me that, your book really connected with me on a certain level or whatever it might be, yeah, I'm pretty sure that would be a very good way to corner me.
Maybe one or two more questions. Is that good? Do we have? Yeah.
So I was wondering, because you said that there's a part of your brain that's always on, if A, your characters ever show up in your dreams, and
Wow.
B, is there anything that you do, like a go-to method to shut that off, like the writer part of your brain that's always like, oh, I could do this, and then I could do that.
Yeah.
Is there a boundary that is tried and true for you?
Yeah, what a great pair of questions. I have never dreamt about my characters, which is actually really interesting. I never thought about that because I certainly have dreamt about people I know in real life, dreamt about like, I had a dream about Joe Biden a few weeks ago, like he's in there. He was very old in the dream and I was very concerned, but it was nice to meet him in my dream. But I've never dreamt about the characters, and if that ever happened, that would be very spooky. Very cool, though. But I think part of it is that my dreams are always so visual, and as I was saying before, like there's a degree to which I can't fully see the characters. I can kind of see everything except their facial features, which is very strange. And as for learning to tamp down or turn off that writerly part of the brain that's always observing and wondering about the story, I think that there are moments of total absorption and flow where that voice gets very quiet. I don't know that it goes away completely, but it diminishes as to be so small that it's barely there. And those are kind of what you would expect from what we know about like mindfulness and flow state. Like meditation certainly helps, but also something like skiing or hiking, or where you're like totally engaged with your body and like present in a beautiful physical environment. But also, and this is going to sound weird, that part of my brain actually doesn't predominate when I am writing. Like when I'm writing, I am fully present with the characters. I'm very much in a flow state, and I don't feel like there's a little part of my brain that's thinking about what to do next. It's just kind of creating. And that's where, time can really disappear for me when I'm writing, when it's going well. There are certainly days where the writing doesn't go well, where it feels sticky and you're just looking at the clock. But the days when the writing goes well, it's kind of like I'm not even there. And it's just sort of happening on the page. Yeah.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Hi. So as someone who just recently reread The Futures, I recommend you do it. It's still so good. And this might be like picking a favorite child question. But if you could spend a day with any of your characters from any of your books,
oh, wow.
who would it be? Like
wow.
It had to be this weekend.
This weekend.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great question. I think that, the first name that comes to mind is Kath Frost, who we've been talking about, who's a character I love so much. But then there's another part of me, and this is a much more minor character. He's not come up in this conversation, but he was actually also present in Our American Friend and is present in the Helsinki Affair, and he'll be sort of a minor character present in the next book. This character named Maurice Adler. And he's a Russian emigre. He left Russia during the Cold War, came to New York. He is sort of a almost like a Zelig-like figure in all of these characters' lives. He's just always there at certain times. And he's very quiet, very enigmatic, very mysterious. And even though, Maurice is a character I've created, I've always wondered, like, what's the deal with Maurice? And I would welcome the opportunity, also because I put him in a very nice townhouse on East 71st Street. And he's a very sophisticated man who always has like tea and cookies for you. So I'd love to go over to his home and talk to him and just try to figure him out. I got a lot of questions for Maurice, and I think I'd have a nice time just chatting with him too.
And did we have one more question from this side of the room that I saw? Or
Anna, what do you find is the most difficult part of the writing process? And how do you work through that and try and get through it or get better?
Yeah. There are sort of two moments that come to mind in the writing process. One is that there's usually a moment when I'm getting pretty deep into the first draft of a book where I've sunk a lot of time and energy into it, but it hasn't quite click together and gain momentum yet. And I start to think, like, is this book ever really going to come together? Like, is it going to come alive? Am I going to figure this book out? And I wonder, like, whether I should go back to the beginning and backtrack and try it all over again. And it's this moment of hesitation before you finally get over the big hump. And then there's usually also a moment much later in the process towards the end where you're getting into the final drafts of the book. And this has been true for me in all of my books. There's like a scene where something seems to be missing, where like we need to go one level deeper to really understand like what it is that this character has sort of how she has transformed or what she's learned or how she's changed. And I haven't quite managed to articulate or capture the emotional core of the story. And that usually takes me a little while to figure out in my writing process. And when I finally figure it out, it's so satisfying. It's like this great breakthrough. But there's usually a moment where I'm like, what is this book really about? Like, I can tell you what the plot is. I can tell you what happens, but what's like the emotional truth of the story? And it takes a while to figure that out.
So thank you so much, Cristina Alger. Thank you, Anna Pitoniak. Thank you, audience. Do stay with us, enjoy some wine and cheese and other good things over there. Do purchase your copy of the Helsinki Affair Compensation. It's in the back there. Do ask Anna to sign it. And feel free to ask other questions and so forth. Come back and see us. Thank you.